continuing our conversations about the cultures of consciousness. I don't often have fiction writers on the show, partly because I don't have that much time to read fiction, which is kind of a lame excuse because I really enjoy reading fiction. But when I do read fiction, I often read old fiction because, frankly, a lot of the time when I read fiction, I turn to it not quite for escapism. I like to read, serious books, beautifully written books, classic pieces of literature. But there's still a sense of leaving the modern world, which I quite enjoy about reading fiction, and which is another reason that I spend a lot of time reading not quite genre literature again, but stuff that approaches the surreal, the weird, the fantastic, the bizarre, because again, I delight in the sense that the world is not quite what it seems, and that if you look at it the right or possibly the wrong way, that gaps open up, possibilities emerge, some of them marvelous, some of them a bit unnerving. This week, I'm really happy to have a writer, not just of fiction, but of nonfiction as well, but known mostly for her fiction, Miranda Mellis, who I've met many years ago, used to live in San Francisco and now teaches up in Evergreen, so gets to live in the beautiful forests of the Northwest. Rainy, but nonetheless, gorgeous place. And I've been rereading her work, some of her work in preparation for this. And one of the things that I love about it, and I'm going to be particularly talking about the earlier her earlier works that came out in about 6-7 years ago. The collection None of This Is Real, a marvelous short book called The Spokes, and her first book, which got a lot of attention. I think it's the first short novel, The Revisionist. What's wonderful about these things for me is that they give me both. They give me the sense that there is this mysterious other world, that there's a kind of allegorical overtone to the ordinary objects of the world, and I have that sense that I'm in the slipstream of literature that tugs against naive realism, which I don't really believe in philosophically or existentially. And yet it is also, in some sense, the world that we live in. And reading these books, even though in some sense they take place in another world, in The Spokes, for example, we go to visit essentially limbo, where the character wanders and finds the shade of her dead circus performing mother, and there's these extraordinary descriptions, not so much, again, not at all genre, juicy narrative crap, but these evocative allegorical moments, but in the cracks of the mystery, in the cracks of these of this enchanted feeling, I recognize precisely the everyday that we're living in, with all of its gruesome political pressures, the terrors of climate change, the sense of pressure and of kind of loss of direction in the sort of social media landscape, in the sort of breakdown of civility, the collapse of America. I mean, all that stuff that in a way you have to work hard to avoid if you're paying attention to the ordinary world. And it's not that this stuff comes up in her work as some kind of obvious political message or some kind of return of like the world we're supposed to be paying attention to, but it's rather that her very attention to the marvelous, the occult, the possible, the strange, is part of the very process of reckoning with our actual historical condition right now. And that tension is very tough to pull off. And I find it very haunting because I'm both, again, enchanted and forced to look from a different angle at some of the day-to-day stresses, concerns, worries, intellectual, critical problems, irresolvable, issues, identities that inevitably come as we're trying to make our way, or at least as I'm trying to make my way through our contemporary crisis. So for that reason alone, I think she belongs on Expanding Mind in terms of kind of striking the bell of many of the topics that we talk about. But she's also just a wonderful thinker and essayist and about all manner of topics in addition to fiction. So with no further ado, Miranda, thanks for joining me on Expanding Mind.
Erik, thank you so much for having me.
Well, I wanted to start off talking about the qualities, and it's probably a little bit less true of your more recent stuff, although there's always this kind of element where you feel like you're reading something that's more like a parable, a fable, an allegory. There's some sort of not real, not totally available, accessible kind of very anti-New Yorker prose. What is it about that form? And yet I know that you're, again, driven by these very pressing concerns about our world, environmentally, socially, politically. It's an important part of your work and your thought. What is it about the form of the kind of the parable or the fable or the sort of almost fairy story, but with strange language that makes you realize that you're reading something that's a bit different, it's a bit arcane? What is it about that form that lets you work out how you're feeling and thinking about these very real and significant matters that are also of concern?
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. So you mentioned earlier this concept of naive realism, and there's this kind of, I think, conventional dichotomy or something. We have this sense that our political problems and our environmental problems and our social problems kind of exist in the realm of something like the real, whereas what we think of as being the marvelous or the fantastical is somewhere very nearby, um, but hovering a little bit away from all of that. And I think one of the things I'm trying to get at um, is my own sort of felt sense, for whatever reason, that those things are not at all different. That the what we take to be sort of the realism of the political is just kind of, striated by irrationality, and that in some way, if we can take, what I recently heard the astrobiologist Adam Frank describe as the 10,000 light year view, the sort of noticing, for example, that all these stars have exoplanets, and kind of just moving out a little bit, like broadening our scale, whether going into the very small or into the very large, just doing a scale shift or a perspective shift, that we begin to see the way that all of the things that we take to be our ordinary situation are very much stories. And and in that sense, we're just sort of picking up from others and from stories how to feel and think about our situation. And so in that way, I guess I think about the parable or the allegory, or fiction generally, as being maybe a kind of affordance, to maybe allow us to, or a political affordance to maybe allow us to sort of see where we are in a different way, and also to see that there are other possibilities. You know.
Yeah, I mean, one of the ways I think about it, I mean, even just now when you talked about the way, we think about politics in terms of the real or realism or being realistic. And even when you said that, I kind of like, I recognize a pattern that I see in myself sometimes because I read a lot of news. And so I read a lot of material that's written, or opinion pages or whatever that are written in a very kind of rational, we got to work this out, and here this just doesn't make sense, we got to do this, da da da, like very kind of realistic world point of view. And I realize sometimes how there's a kind of secret sort of story that's being foisted upon you in that very mode, which is that okay, all these touchy-feely feelings and all this sort of idea of how things could be, well, that's just not the world we actually live in. So if you're really going to kind of just be honest with the situation, then it makes more sense to consider X, Y, and Z. And not to say that there's an inherent conservatism in being realistic. There could be, depending on your ideals and motives, it could go in many directions. But there is a strange kind of I don't know, there's like an ideology of realism that
Yeah.
even if you're not trying to think like, I'm a rational person, I'm not going to think irrationally, I'm just going to make my political decisions based on reason, even if you're not doing that, being that hardcore, just sort of imbibing that world, you lose touch with the uncanniness of the political, or the uncanniness of the ecological crisis that's in our face. And so it's a weird way of both detaching and also, I think in some ways, kind of, not if not becoming more conservative, but just delimiting the space where you can move to create an illusion of rational control and choice.
Yeah, yeah. And I think in that way, you say there's an ideology of realism, that somehow that ideology has captured reason itself, or has captured rationality in a way that is not real, right? Like a higher order realism, or a higher order pragmatism, or a higher order rationalism, doesn't operate that way. A higher order rationalism tells us that there are emergent properties, that things are nonlinear, that the the kind of conventional boundedness of what we call the political is really fluid. So I wonder about what other kind of modalities could inform what we call the political. If for example, you and I are both we both have long kind of history with Buddhist teachings. And one of the things I've been thinking about is the tenet of not knowing, and whether what can not knowing provide the political as an antidote, where what you described as the ideology of realism that kind of has a grip on the political, has to do with this kind of like incredibly artificial, perpetual reproduction of statements by the subjects who know, or something like that, where language becomes so emptied out. So it's not just not knowing, but it's the poetic. Like what would a political that's informed by the understandings of poetics look
Yeah,
like?
yeah, I can think about that. I mean, right now, what's popping in my mind particularly is climate change, which is not. I mean, it is the political in certain ways, but there's another sort of dimension to it that maybe requires a slightly different language. But it's so evident that part of what the issue is the fact that even people who aren't jumping on the denial bandwagon, even people who recognize the issue, there's just you don't know where to put it. And I keep thinking about a influence on both of us is the work of Timothy Morton, and the way he talks about the uncanniness of getting into your car and turning on your car to go get milk from the store or whatever, and that you're contributing to global warming in that act. Because it doesn't make any sense. You're just turning on your car. It's just one car. What's the big deal? Whatever. But the fact that we are part of these much larger forces and forms that are themselves engaging with even larger and more incomprehensible things like global warming, which we can't really think about. We can think about a tornado over here. We can think about the weather's hotter. We can think about politics in Washington, but we can't really think about the climate, the global climate as a whole. So there's invariably a kind of uncanniness. And so if we think that we get in touch with this issue purely through reason, purely through statistics, through making arguments, through making sure that scientists are making decisions because they're more regional, they have more access to rational operations than ordinary citizens do. We're only going to get so far. It's not really until you take on the weirding of global warming as a phenomenological existential experience that we have individually and culturally, and really kind of, I don't want to say accept that, but begin to work within that space of poetry, of uncanniness, of the weird, of the unnerving condition of it, and to recognize that existential quality, which is more like fiction, it's more like Stranger Things than it is like a documentary about the planet Earth.
Right.
That's actually where we live and engage this situation. And so if we just keep putting that off into mere, subjective feelings or fictions or whatever, I don't see how we really accept the situation we're in. I think you could say the same thing about social media and the way technology and propaganda are changing, consensus reality. But that's a different conversation. Just to sort of say that I think the weird is, which is my kind of term for this non-rational but still part of a larger rational or reasonable way of looking at the world, that it's really a portal into scary places, but places without which we are not going to get out of the trance of naive realism.
Yeah, and I think so part of, this concept of the hyper object and of our entanglement and of how the hyper object describes this. I love this, like the way that Morton talks about it being viscous and sticking to us, this entanglement that we're trying to look at a problem that we're situated within, that we can't, we're embedded within. And so I've been thinking about this actually with in relation to meditation practice, where there's this slowing down to observe entanglement, right, and kind of disidentify, or the paradox of sort of being able to see that one is not willing whatever it is that's going on, and it's going on nonetheless, and completely structuring you, but it's impermanent. And so I guess, with regards to fiction as a practice or as a political affordance, this sort of primary kind of move, I guess you would say, of the fiction writer, is to put yourself in the place of another, to like purposely entangle yourself, to to envision what their tasks are, to imagine their movements, to be with a fellow being in their struggle, to imagine their struggle, and in that way, like kind of intentionally entangle yourself and stick yourself, stick your nose into someone else's business. So I see that as being, that's an act of creativity, but it's also an act of empathy and of dissolving those borders intentionally, and getting in. And there is something just uncanny about it, about opening yourself up to that. So maybe in that way, there's a question here about sensibilities and about the incredible incommensurability of sort of maybe what you might call like a political animal, and I mean, this I think is one of the very real things that we have to also face. Is like there's this entanglement, but there's also this incommensurability, maybe between people's experiences. Like we can put ourselves in the place of another, but we don't, that doesn't mean we now know, um, what I can't know what your life has been, and
Yeah.
what your experience has been on some level. I can, so there's this sort of, what is it like to be a bat controversy or something, right? It's ethically, I need to, for, I take Kutsia's view that ethically um, I need to know that I can't imagine what it's like to be a bat. I can't cut myself off from the bat. But in this other way, there is this incommensurability between these spheres, and that's part of what I find. Well, what is so frustrating about our situation, right? Is like, how do we, um, maybe we can't really solve politics with politics after all, but then what does that mean for people who are working, whose sensibility is totally, maybe that's their art, right? Is to be in that,
Yeah.
to see things that way. Um,
Yeah, I'm really struck by this idea because there's a lot of conversation about empathy, and empathy as a sort of generally a progressive value in our current strife, maybe a liberal value as well. And I think I've been sort of definitely wrestling this. I suspect you as well. Even just recently with the way in which um, the separation of families at the border has become this kind of event, and it's become a scandal, an event, a forced reckoning, and we're all sitting there drawn into this partly staged theater because even if this is a policy that is happening, and it is something that is deeply upsetting, and that triggers many of our more basic kind of moral values. Like you get right down to your core values with this kind of activity. At the same time, there's this weird sense that okay, it's another one of these mediated events that I can't entirely take in its own terms. And so what it's brought up for me is partly a simultaneous need for empathy, which is partly about being able to connect through our entanglement, to put ourselves in the place of the other, to use that fictional imagination, but outside of the unreal, and towards others,
mm,
genuine points of difference. And at the same time, it's not going to deliver a kind of foundation, I don't think,
right.
at least in the way it's politicized, and in a way that relates to what you were saying about how you have to act like you can imagine what it is to be a bat, and yet you don't know, and that not knowing is not going to be filled in by science. It's not going to be filled in by some crazy mystical vision. It's not going to be filled in by devoting your whole life to studying bats. There is this kind of opacity to
Yeah.
things and to others, and we can't. I mean, so maybe it's good for some people to be naive about that because it allows them to do other things that are very valuable. But once you kind of see that bind, which is again something that Timothy Morton and other speculative realists talk about, this bind of simultaneously resonating with, being in relation to, absolutely needing to imagine some kind of communication or connection, and at the same time that being uh, only going so far. It's a very strange place to be, and it's hard to act. It's hard to know how to act within that space, and yet it seems to be part of what our moment is inviting at least some of us into.
Yes. Yes, I agree. And I think that in fact that not knowing, I mean, to me, humility is one of the most liberating of qualities. It's not a diminishment, it is totally liberating. And that opacity that you're talking about, I mean, the post-colonial philosopher and poet, Glissant talks about, he writes, I clamor for the right to opacity for everyone, and kind of posits what he calls the poetics of relation, founded in this opacity and this incommensurability that it's not it's it's not a problem, you know, on some level. It's what the problem is when we're trying to make others be like us, or we're trying to act as though people should be something transparent that I can see right through, you know, and that it's illegibility that becomes the unbearable problem for some people, I guess, that you know, that causes this othering that then allows the brutal monstrosity of putting children in cages, you know, and and so forth. But this poetics of relation is to relate um, relationships between opacities. Um, um, and that, I think, you know, so in that sense, so how could, going back to kind of um, politics, like how can humility be a, be the grounding for our
Yeah.
politics?
You know, it's interesting when I think about like it's so hard, it's so dark, and there's so many of the countervailing forces right now, you know, whether it's you know, drawing boundaries, you know, masters who know, you know, focused, empowered violence that feeds off of, you know, all these regressive tendencies in human identity that we could talk about sociologically or biologically or whatever. That it seems so kind of childish or naive
Yeah.
to be like resting. I'll think, oh, well, what's the politics of not knowing? What's the politics of empathy without, you know, claiming to be able to speak for the other, all these kinds of things. But what it reminds me of is kind of debates, which are, you know, debatable, but the debates about nonviolence as a mass power, like how you can stop colonial empires with nonviolence. That doesn't make any sense. That's ridiculous. You can't stop a, you know, well-armed colonial empire with nonviolence. Well, in certain circumstances, maybe you can. And so the absurdity around the delicacy of some of these political questions in a way has to be kind of embraced as that same sort of gesture, as a nonviolent protest, as nonviolence as a principle, ethical principle that over time ultimately makes, you know, makes a move. So the humility, there is some kind of place for that humility. It seems impossible. It seems absurd in some ways because it's such everything's going in the opposite direction. I mean,
Right.
I mean, even like conventional global politics 20 years ago looks like a, you know, a hippie fest of kumbaya compared to where we're at now. I mean, it's just absurd that it's so degenerated. And yet, in a way, that's what else you got than the impossibility of hope, because all of these things seem so relevant to me. These questions of humility, of not knowing. How do you speak and not know at the same time?
Yeah, right. And when we say it's childish, it's like it says something about how we're seeing things that kind of, in a sense, like I think what you're saying, you know, that basic wisdom is something so beyond the pale, you know. Um, and reflexivity, just the ability to stop and see how we're seeing and what assumptions we're bringing to the situation. Although I do feel like I see that happening too in various ways in the discourse and the public sort of spheres. um yeah.
That the reflexivity is more available, that people are more able or just to recognize how their own thoughts and feelings and beliefs are kind of located somewhere, and they have
Yeah,
to.
it feels like there's, you know, there's a kind of public conversation, mainstream conversation happening that's, you know, very fraught, of course, about things like bias, you know, and what is bias, but, you know, sort of the fact that we hold views that we don't know we hold, or that we respond in ways that we don't will, you know, um, and so to talk about it, even though in some ways it's what Uwe Puerskin, the linguist, would describe as a plastic word, or a kind of word that starts to just mean nothing, you know. but to talk about it is to in a way to talk about reflexivity, implicit bias, something that is happening below the top shelves of consciousness.
Yeah, and
um,
it's a funny one too because I've been tracking that a little bit lately, partly because I read that I think it was actually in the was it in the Times? I don't remember where. I think it was in the New York Times, where there was an article about bias and how it's sort of it's hardwired. There's evolutionary reasons for it. It's all the language of science, psychobiology. And so we've been studying where we can find this in the brain, and look, we can see that this particular area floods when people are shown pictures of the other side or whatever, that kind of, you can imagine what the tests are. And kind of then coming down to basically saying, well, we can engineer this out. We might be able to engineer this out of people.
well,
And then you're like, okay, so like that's like the whole zone of the unconscious, whether we think of it as bias, as all of the kinds of biases that people talk about, confirmation bias, virtue signaling. There's all of these weird little elements of sort of sociobiological unconscious thinking that are bubbling up into politics as kind of either weapons or as possible solutions. And that's, I think, important to, we got to, that's part of the way that we come to terms with the way in which we are biased, the way in which that it does help reflexivity, but it also often just gets plugged into some kind of weird, technocratic solutionism, which is almost equally, disturbing. So it's like almost like, because it's another one of those binds where we have to acknowledge what we don't know, acknowledge the way that we're biased, or let's say, but also take responsibility for it, even though in some sense we're not responsible for it because we're not aware of the mechanism. We didn't plant it there. We're not thinking in those terms, and yet it's there beneath the surface operating. And so you're back to that existential situation of like, do I have to take responsibility for that which I did not actually choose? And I
right.
still think you do.
Yeah.
But most people I don't think want to do that.
Yeah, well, I think it's really understandable how one might resist it, right? Because we're identified with our intentions. So if we're told that we're sort of intending things that we don't intend, or that we're having effects that not only we not intend them, we actually um, abjure them or abhor them. Like when we were talking about entanglement, with climate change or even racism. Like that there's this sense, well, but this is, how can I be having these effects when I not only don't intend to, but I abhor these effects. How, and it's, because we think that we're private beings, or that language is somehow private, um, and that we're not inhabited by everything and striated by everything that we exist within history and political structures and social structures. But I really, and this is where again I think like the contemplative really has a lot to offer, because there's the possibility of disidentification, of saying, okay, well, yeah, there, even a moment of being able to see, and granted, it's a long and arduous journey, but even a moment of being able to see, I haven't willed nearly almost anything I've thought. So of course I could be having effects that I don't intend to have,
Exactly.
that I can't recognize, because the mind is just churning out all these thoughts that I haven't intended, and the mouth opens and says things that are the opposite of what I mean and feel,
Mm-hmm.
or what I would want. And I mean, I think all of this goes to sort of uh, greed, hatred, and delusion, our situation of ignorance, and kind of questions of what it means to wake up, and how. And you talked about the technocratic, like the scientistic wanting to go right to, well, let's fix this broken machine, you know. Um, yeah, well, what about let's sit with this wounded animal,
Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. Yeah, let's just. I often feel that way on the pill. It's great to hear you talk about meditation and the Dharma, because it seems very fresh from me to hear you talk about it in these terms and to put it into politics in this way, because I think there's a lot. I mean, there's so many different, if you want to call them Western Buddhisms now. There's so many different ways that meditation is being framed and used and abused. And I mean, I think you're really right to point to, it's not about that it's going to make you better. It's not about that it's going to make you more efficient or maybe happier or whatever. That might happen, and that's cool. But as a tool of inquiry, and inquiry into this self, not the self that wants to be actualized, not the self that wants to be improved, not the self that wants to, be liked, not all of those guys, but a tool of inquiry into seeing how those things arise
Mm.
as a space of some kind of, again, very tentative, gentle, will o' the wisp almost, but still a space of a possibility for a different kind of politics, a different kind of way of connecting, of being in the field within which we are woven at a deeper level than all those selves that want to actualize, the selves that want to improve, the selves that want to master and gather and gain attention, which is the mainstream game that's now just off the rails.
Yeah, well, Dogen says, um, to treat the that which wants gain and fame with the kind of compassion that you treat your family members with. Like, treat. He says treat, the desire for fame, as a or fame itself as a sentient being, deserving of compassion. I mean, along with all those other selves. Um, and you were listing all those selves that come up, and I there's also the self that wants not to harm, right, or wants not to cause harm. And how do we, as a practice, like, kind of, I've been thinking about this. I guess it's, another way of describing it would be like ethical sublimation or something. Sort of, how do we take those energies that you're talking about that our culture fosters, and kind of use them as ingredients and coax them towards this other disposition, right? Like, that there is also, along with all those other selves, this self that wants not to cause harm, or wants to, you know, um, I don't know, just this very, um, what I think in the Buddhist teachings is described as this kind of elemental awakened quality, like that when you see somebody that you don't know just stumble, that you would automatically reach out to help them, or when somebody drops something, you just, and they can't reach it, you pick it up for them. These very simple moments of sort of, that show us this other self that wants to not harm. um, and that everybody, that everybody experiences. And how do we, like, there, how do we notice that, kind of notice that um, simple response, that quality, and kind of bring it into the political. I'm sure I sound incredibly naive. I've been
Well,
just
I mean, I think the whole conversation we're having is a way, like, it's like, it's funny, we started out making fun of naive realism, and this is kind of
right.
like, whatever,
Realism
the
is
real,
where
I don't know what even, unrealism, weird realism, naive, weird realism.
yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think that point, that subtle place you're pointing to is really key. I mean, to me, it has a lot to do with the body. That when you're actually sharing space with people, that at least I would like to think that more people have access to that sort of simple openness as a possibility than when we're, reading a news feed. And that part of what's happening now is a kind of, ferociously weaponized feedback loop of the abstract character of both language and media, really just kind of, like exploding or imploding in a way that disconnects us from a lot of our, let's say, more embodied values.
Mhm.
And I am totally sure that many people whose speech acts online, I would say, are more or less trolling in a different condition, in a spontaneous and natural way, would whatever, pick up the drop thing, or be this, like, be warm, or at least open. I would like to think that. Maybe I need to think that. Then maybe that's a personal mythology, because I can't quite accept that things are so hateful all the way down to the ground. But that then requires that space to return, the space of physical interaction of the public, and of being able to move around. Like, it's like that's easy for me to do in my liberal, enclave, and you live in a liberal enclave. But what happens when I show up in rural, Iowa, and go, hey man, what's going on? Let's be all brother. It's suddenly a very different scene. And that's all there. Like, there's a lot of really positive values among conservative people in the United States. I mean, they're linked to other things that I find some of them problematic and some of them horrible, but those values are there. And then, in fact, part of the resentment of conservatives against liberal enclaves and the coastal elites, et cetera, is that they feel like they don't even get any cred for the certain forms of values that I would say are positive in the right kind of framework. Um, so
Yeah.
but how to get there is so tough. It's so tough.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of I'm brought to mind of a little book by Simone Weil called The Abolition of All Political Parties. It's such a great little pamphlet. And I mean, part of the problem is the language, right? These categories, the quote unquote liberal enclave, or the quote unquote conservatives, or the right, I mean, what
Yeah.
she said in this book is like, she just it's a polemic really against political parties, saying that we should be supporting kind of political agents and agencies based on the actions they take and the work they do, and not their affiliations and kind of identities, right? Like that the idea of the right and the left, um, you know, these broad categories, or we'll say Democrats and Republicans. I mean, how stuck are we in those incredibly reified, overdetermined categories where people kind of just upload these these identities, and then that kind of erases what you're describing, which is all these other kind of you know um, incredibly complex differences and nuances, and it's like these reified categories are getting in the way, and I sort of like, when after I read that Simone Weil, I felt like, I mean, I live among trees, and I feel sort of like that's more informing for me than the notion of liberalism. I also react to that, because my mother was uh, rather militant, and she used to say, "Scratch a liberal, find a fascist." So I sort of grew up with that, but I grew up with sort of activists, um, and in this kind of, I guess, like, um, identity of leftism, but the attentiveness of kind of a contemplative practice or a writing practice, um, you know, calls on one to ask, what effects our descriptions and our categories have on our capacity to work on our problems. And this is again where kind of poetics and language and question of description. How are we? I had a student who recently wrote a great thesis about the history of in the nomenclature of invasion biology, and kind of charted the correlation of rises of xenophobia with the rise of this nomenclature, and was really like looking at how even the category invasive species might prevent us from seeing the ways in which a lot of species need to migrate because of climate change, and how is our nomenclature getting in the way of us being able to see that what we call that it's on a case by case basis, that there could be that species could be called invasive that are actually beneficial in all sorts of other ways. So I don't know, it just seems so important to have that conversation too, right? You know, like,
Absolutely. I mean, I'm just even reflecting, even as I went on my last little kind of point, how once I started to talk about these issues, it was just easier to pick up the well used tokens of right, left, liberal, enclave, da da da, like to make a point. And it's just like I just can't help but being reflexive about my own mind right here. And particularly when I'm speaking in public, so I have to kind of watch it because you can't do talk about politics on in the public sphere is a little dicey. So it's
yeah,
just easier, even if the very point I was trying to make was about getting to that place beneath these abstract categories that are causing so much harm. It's
yeah,
easier to describe that because you're not as exposed. You're still in the op-ed landscape, which in a way the whole thing from right to left in those terms is all sort of maintaining um, that resistance to digging into these more ambiguous places where we're connected to people in all sorts of ways we can't name, all sorts of affective ways we only see in stories or dreams, and can't language and certainly can't put on some kind of graph of demographics.
yeah. And when we step back and look at things in kind of parable terms or mythic terms, it really all starts to look very, very different.
Well,
Um,
that's an interesting one. I mean, what it means to do that. I mean, there's, one of the ways that I was thinking of earlier in the conversation was I was thinking about the way in which, not all the time, but I often consciously attempt to think in my own kind of animist way because it forces me to, or encourages me, seduces me even sometimes, to acknowledge relationality where I was taught to to just operate instrumentally. So
mm,
suddenly I have, and it, it's easy to do with pets. You can do it with horses, no problem. A tree that you love on your way to work, that's easy. You start small, and then you start realizing more and more that it takes you to increasingly inhuman places, and it enforces humility to suddenly acknowledge that, in a way, even the technologies in the environment and all of these flows, and even the ugly plants and the ice plant that was brought here from South Africa to like be in the suburbs, and now it's escaped into the thing, and you're like, what's my relation to this thing? How do I, okay, invasive species, yeah, but there's this life form here that's doing its thing, and how do I relate with that? And it's also impossible. It's like impossible, like nonviolent resistance is impossible, or that humility in our current discursive environment, a political environment, is impossible. It's also impossible to acknowledge the sort of agency of all the things that we interact with. And yet it's a mythic mode, a mode that draws from capacities for fiction, for dream, for visionary experience, for psychoactives. It draws from that, and yet it also has its own kind of politics, the politics of the other, of a non-human other, as well as others that we maybe don't know and don't relate with in the human realm, but more specifically in the kind of environmental realm. And to me, that's a very concrete place where the imagination, which we usually put off to the side, really can shift your relationality and even your sense of obligation, your sense of ethics, as you think about a world that will only go forward as a whole variety of relations of humans and non-humans, not as humans controlling the show.
yes, absolutely. And what does description have to do with that? I mean, what is the difference between calling a bee a pollinator and calling a bee your brother, you know? Um, yeah. And what is the difference between defining ourselves as being on the right and being on the left, and defining ourselves as a species, even if, even if species is a kind of also problematic category, and also as an invasive species, how do we take responsibility for ourselves as a species, living on this planet with all these other beings who we, you know, um, I'm just for projects that can quote unquote decenter the human in that sense. I think that's a more productive direction than kind of this constant reproduction of these reified categories of
Yeah.
human politics, you know. Um,
I agree. I think that's part of the issue is just that's partly where the technology enters, is that on a really simple level, that the explosion of information devices and smartphones and the internet everywhere, and the addictive character of social media and gaming and all that, is that, I'm fascinated by that world. I think there's great aspects to it. It's not like I'm just a straight neo-Luddite, but it's very obvious that once you enter into those circuits, you're just sort of flowing with essentially human signs. Yes, they're technologically mediated by non-human technological others, who will become increasingly sprightly in the coming years. That will be interesting. But it's still that you're so pulled out of all these other relations all the time. So and I see that on in so much, politics across the board, and the obsession with identity and with fixing identity and with defining identity and fighting through identity, and it's just a very it's a strange time to kind of locate oneself as the one who disidentifies, because it's like, what is the politics of disidentifying? Is it just a dropout politics? Is it just a localized politics, because now I'm just in my body with my relations on a day-to-day basis with trees and local food providers and whatever. But what is that larger level that has that disidentification to it? What does it mean to disidentify and be able to affirm or try to work a politics on a large scale, the scale at which so many of our crises are already existing?
right. Yeah. It strikes me that there's something there about being able to be, um, to ask what serves, or to ask what to be of service, to be able to be disidentified such that one might be able to see what's needed, you know. Does that allow us to see more and to respond, to be able to respond when we're called upon to respond, to show up, to pitch in, and if we're just really identified, overly identified with a position or with a view. I mean, all these things, again, they seem to go to questions of view. Um,
Well, we only have a couple of minutes here, and I realize that we've gone through this whole thing, and I had all these like kind of personal questions I wanted to ask you, stuff you'd thrown out at me. So I'm just going to put one, which is that, have you it's sort of along the lines you've just been talking about service, which is at some point recently you were entering into a chaplaincy program. Are you still doing that?
yeah, I've just started doing that a few months ago, and um, yeah, and it's causing me to take up a slightly more, well, definitely more formal study of things that I've been sort of engaging with on and off for a long time, very casually and informally, to really do. I have to like study the precepts and write precept glosses, and um, so it's a Zen Buddhist based but interfaith chaplaincy program. Um, and I don't know what the outcome of that will be. I talked to a former student of mine recently, and I told her about it, and she said, "Well, it just seems like the same thing you've always been doing in a way as a teacher. Like it's not. I mean, is you teach, you've taught. Like I think teaching is so much about witnessing and drawing out people's powers and potentials and really listening. And I think chaplaincy is related. It just is. They're different kind of responsibilities and environments. And I think my part of my draw to that has been to be able to possibly work in other environments, be it in prisons or hospitals or else, otherwise. Yeah,
Yeah,
because I'm not sure how, like I feel like maybe I'll be in academia for the rest of my life, but there's a way in which I've been feeling um, a draw to explore other possibilities.
yeah, that makes sense. But so it's a nice shift because it's organic. It is coming out of things you've already been invested in, interested in, and yet it does open up different spaces where the kinds of service and the kinds of encounters and the kinds of challenges and perceptions that you would have would be, I can only assume broader than teaching literature and critical theory and a good college. It's a very different kind of situation.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. It's a different kind of situation.
does it make you feel like you're more of a Buddhist because you kind of have to be?
Well, I don't know. I mean, again, there's that identification thing. I mean, one of the uh, ceremonies that happens in this program is you take Jukai, you receive the precepts, and then that's some kind of consecration into the lineage. Um, I've always been so reluctant uh, to identify with it, but I don't, I think because I think of these teachings as being um, you know um, philosophical in some ways, more than religious, but I'm overcoming that, and I'm interested in kind of the formalities, observing the forms and ceremonies, as it were, and especially the collectivity of that, the kind of ways in which doing that uh, breaks you out of the kind of solitary mode and puts you into collectivity, even at the level of collective movements, collective um, ways of collective choreographies. And I grew up really in a very, my mother, religion is the opiate of the mass, very, atheist kind of space. And so, but my sort of insight recently, in a Zendo, moving through various movements with other people in a ceremonial space, was like, here, um, this is collective, this is like this dance, and it is inculcating this disposition towards collectivity in a way that sort of solitary practice doesn't do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're gonna have to wind it up here. We're in our dialogue practice. So Miranda, thanks so much for joining us on Expanding Mind.
Oh, thank you, Eric. It was a pleasure.
All right, folks. Until next week, keep your minds open.